Welcome to TradeTheMGuide.com. This is John. This report is for the 25th of January, and wow, that was quite a day, and right within what we talked about. As much as everyone was gloom and dooming it as things were plummeting, we also knew that we were down at these levels where bounce back could be, more than probable. And in fact, not only did it bounce back from minus, over 130 some odd ES points, but to finish positive post-market right now. And you can see with the white leading, we still had magenta starting to rise later in the day. It's still horrible overall, so this is a remarkable comeback, but that's that kind of oversold buyback that we can see. We saw it happening intraday, and I posted about where we could see the change starting to take place. From an NQ standpoint, likewise, broke below that 0% line, went quite a ways underneath it, and then finishing right back to it. And that's typically what happens when you break those long-standing levels, and that was just a matter of they were looking for how much supply there would be below there, and then once the buy programs kicked in, boom, it was fast and quite dramatically within that space. Now, that's still said, some people were like, it's the end of the world, but it really hasn't been that much of a drop-off, relatively speaking, for what the numbers look like. Of course, Euro not really affected, not really doing anything there. Gold's still going to continue to climb because all the other things, oil and that, and you can see as much as there was this huge flight to safety there, a little bit of a turn back, getting rates back up just fractionally, but we would expect that low to be broken from a TLT standpoint as the expectation that rates have to rise. Of course, everyone thought that the decline in the market would force the Fed to change their mind, and obviously there's signs of weakness in the economy that continue to pop up. So the last thing anyone would expect is the Fed raising rates into potentially recessionary inputs, but in the 70s, you had stagflation, where you had a recession along with rates needing to climb just to quell inflation. So it can happen again. Would they do it again that way? Probably not, just because of the upheaval, particularly going into primary election later on in the year. So that presents all sorts of issues. From a Bitcoin standpoint, of course, we had 34K as a number that we expected to see hit, and followed through a little bit, and then as the market started to rally, likewise it did as well. And again, that's going to be back and forth as well, and anyone who thinks these things are just going to all fall apart all at the same time and stay that way indefinitely. Even in the '07 crash and things like that, you had huge market rallies in that, and so this is something I warned about to be prepared for, because that happens a lot within overall declines. It's just that the lows get lower and the highs not as high. And that's pretty consistent with that. But these readings have been spot on within following that overall setup. Turning to ETH, quite a day. And I'm pointing out how much I like that 5K on ETH here, Ethereum, and following along, it's pretty consistent with the way it performs within the algo setup. And this was quite a volume day, but you can see as it started to catch the buybacks, we started to get the rise. Even with the white leading there, the magenta popped up above right towards the end, so that when the decline came, it was just to the 50%, and then magenta stayed in the lead from there, and that led to pretty much where it finished off. I mean, still off, but huge recovery from where it was. From a 50K standpoint, you'll have a slight difference on mine. I've been working with the adjustments on the short side of it and eliminating some of those buys that can take place within this overall dip, particularly where red MBI leads. Those often don't produce much of a consistent return until that magenta leads back over. So like going through here, suspect with that, but then once the magenta gets over, it's a matter of how far it stays within that. And had a brief meltdown there where that was pretty good opportunity, where good likelihood of continuing to the short, but Immediately, magenta spikes back above, and that was really the precursor that began it all, because where the cover takes place is right where we would expect when you get that kind of configuration for it to turn around, and that's exactly what it did from a 5K. Whew. Started out with that brief early morning pop, had a couple of positive extremes within that, so expected the fill of those, and then once that fill started, it just kept going, and it was quite a volume day. I mean, as I just keep scrolling across here, you're going to see, I mean, we had days where we were like less than one screen, and this is going to be like 3 or 4 of them sliding across. But like I was pointing out, even within this, there were some decent buy configurations that started, and they usually begin with that gold rising with the azure as well as the magenta. When it happened over here, you were still with white leading, and so that didn't lead to anything, but this was just the opposite. After the deep shakeout started to improve and led to some pretty decent pops even within the dip. But as they faded, we kept revisiting these older previous algo levels, and then we kept producing the spikes, and that's when it started to get a little bit healthier. And I was pointing out here on the Skype chat turnaround points, because again, rising azure gold there, and magenta overtook it, and that began the early part of what was pretty decent turnaround. By decent, I mean, 100 points plus, coming back off the lows there. We ended up with a couple little soft setups, but every time those dips started to flatten around, we ended up with magenta coming in, so it was a matter of short-lived on some of those later ones, and you had to be flexible enough to turn around, and that's a matter of reading that shakeout, turning around, moving up to the positive side of the zero line of it, and then continuing, and we ended up with the gold rising in that as we went across, and still though produced plenty of decent sell configurations within that, where there's that red rising within it, and even though the magenta got above, white shot above it, and that pulled it down right before that final run. As we go through, you can see was quite a bit of back and forth, and there were still quite a few points to be made even within these brief short hiccups, but you can see that none of those short hiccups were having magenta dipping below the 10 level of that, and that usually ends up being decent strength, and putting that into program a little more complicated, but definitely represents part of that continuation when we don't get that follow through after it started to dip. It doesn't dip down below that 10, and then likewise here where it turned around above, and that was the final rip that took it through. Only here in the later part where we're getting close to it again, but did exactly the same thing, so we're likely to see a little bit more continuation. So, whew, quite a day. A lot of activity with that, and not surprising. I think that that kind of volatility probably is not going to be as extreme, as we've worked out a lot of the fear factor of potential rate increases, as well as the other economic numbers that suggest that maybe it's not all that justified to have as many rate increases, blah, 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 blah. So I think that's just going to be back and forth, and we're just going to have to stay with what the readings are and continue to follow them like that. But as always, I will continue to update you on the Skype chat, and continue to do updates to the strategies in that, so I will definitely be passing those along as well. As always though, trade well. We'll talk to you later.